Dr. Miller, I am so pleased to welcome you to the Ingenious You community.
Well, thank you. It's a privilege to be here.
Now, our listeners always like to know something about the backstory of the leaders that we interview. And in your case, you were born and raised in a rural farming community in Tranquility, California. I love the name, first of all. What a great thing to be from a place called Tranquility. You are the fourth generation of the Miller family to live and work there. So I just have to ask you how your early experiences shaped your views on education and how they inform your approach to leadership.
Well, I'm a very unlikely person to be doing what I'm doing. So in essence, I grew up on a small farm. It was a dairy farm when my father grew up, and his father. And when I was about 5, I think we had 10,000 chickens in the backyard. But it's really hot in Tranquility. It's over 100 degrees most days in the summer. You have to irrigate all the time. My dad told me if you don't go to college, this is what you'll do for the rest of your life. So I got interested in going to school. And when I went to college, I went to the University of California because of a very progressive program for admissions there. And I met the first person I'd ever met with a PhD and the first person who was an engineer. And I decided to major in aerospace engineering so I could get as far away as I could from dirt and water. So that's kind of how it started.
Now, you have been widely praised, as you know, for your innovative leadership at the University of Iowa College of Engineering and then at Olin, among other places. And I'm wondering what experiences and influences shaped the career path that ultimately led you to assume the first presidency and to be the first employee at Olin College of Engineering, but also how you make sense of your obvious ability to innovate in an educational setting and how you inspire
Well,
others to change.
a little bit of background. It's not uncommon for children on the farm, farm kids, to grow up and go into engineering. It turns
Oh,
out that farming is all about making things work when you're far away from big cities and lots of help. So duct tape and baling wire, and then you make it work, whatever it takes. So you learn to be self-reliant, you learn to think about making things, and you also are pretty close to financial stress because you put everything you own in the ground every year, and it depends on the weather and on international crop prices and all the rest. So you're kind of aware of the financial dimensions of things. The farming background was interesting, but probably the most important thing is what happened later. I graduated from the University of California in aerospace engineering and with really an interest in earthquakes and earthquake engineering as well. And I wound up teaching at the University of California at Santa Barbara. Because of the faculty agreements in universities with engineering, because it's a profession, they encourage you to consult 1 day a week. I wound up doing some consulting work at a company called Astro Research Corporation. This particular place changed my life. It was really unusual. They compete with JPL on the design of very large spacecraft for exploring the solar system and so forth. So, for example, in the Smithsonian, there's an illustration, there's a sample of this satellite that they built there called the Voyager, and the Voyager has deployable booms on it, which were built by this little tiny company with 25 employees outside of Santa Barbara. Along the way, I worked for a guy who was the president at the time, John Hedgepeth, who was probably the most gifted engineer I've ever known. I'll just tell you one project. We had to design a satellite to chase Halley's Comet and to get some of it and bring it back to the Earth. People didn't know what it was. Is this really part of our solar system? Because it doesn't look like it's in the same kind of orbit. In fact, all the other planets are in a plane. Think of it as a tabletop with the sun in the middle, like the sugar bowl, and everything is rotating around in the same direction, the Earth, Venus, Mars, and so on. But Halley's Comet is going the wrong way. It's going backwards, and it's not in the plane. it dips down from an angle, and it takes it 85 years or something close to that to make one rotation.
Hmm.
So you get one shot at this in your lifetime because you're going to be gone before it comes back. There was a big push to go catch Halley's Comet in the 1980s. And the problem is you almost can't get there from here. If you launch from the Earth, you're going the wrong way. So you have to make a U-turn. Then you have to accelerate to catch up to it. Then you have to get some of it in a box or something, and then turn around, make another U-turn, and fly home. If you do the math, there is no chemical propellant that has enough what's called specific impulse to do that. They're not powerful enough. There's only two ways of doing it. One way is nuclear ion propulsion, and nobody was enthusiastic about putting a nuclear reactor on the top of a rocket near Disney World. So the alternative is to use something called solar sailing, which most people don't know this, but photons from the sun are both waves and particles. And because they have particle-like characteristics, when they bounce off of something, they impart momentum. And therefore, it could be a push on a sail. So JPL was well along in designing this thing called the solar sail, which is 1 square mile kite that flies in the solar wind. But the problem is it weighs so much, and it, like just the cross members on the kite weigh several times the weight of the space shuttle. So it takes a whole bunch of missions to go up there, a lot of extravehicular activity to build it. So our mission at Astro Research Corporation was to beat that idea. We did it with something called the heliogyro. The heliogyro is a helicopter that flies in the solar wind.
Huh.
Now, this thing has 12 blades, and each blade is 7 miles long. And it goes up in one shot. It doesn't require astronauts to assemble it, and it just spins up so that you let the blades out, kind of like they were, pieces of toilet paper unrolling. And eventually, it can fly in the solar wind and never runs out of fuel, and it's very light.
Hmm.
Figuring out how to design that, it turns out, was really hard. There aren't any equations that I learned at Caltech or MIT as a graduate student that apply to this. And there's no way to test the thing on the ground because we have gravity. We wound up bringing in a origamist from Japan to help us figure out how you're going to fold up, 7 miles of this Mylar film.
Hmm.
The whole takeaway for me is that engineering is not about equations and about physics. Engineering is about conceptions and design. If you can't envision it, you'll never make it. And vision is the quantity that is in short supply, and it's incredibly important. So I learned that what engineering was about when I was at Astro and I was in my 20s. Then I moved on to USC in Los Angeles, and I'm on to teaching a course in aerospace structural design, even though I was in civil engineering at the time. And I learned a lot more about this because everybody had said, well, engineers need to be prepared for the workplace, so you should teach them something about designing things that are practical. Hey, this Miller guy has done some consulting. Let's ask him to teach the class. So I never taught a course in that, and none of my background was in that area. So I made a folder, and I kept in it the names of lots of people in the aerospace field in the LA area that I had worked with, and asked them a question. Can you send me a one-page description of the technical problem you're currently working on? And I'll just put it in this folder. And then I'm going to try this class where I have the students pick out one of these problems in small groups, like 4 or 5 kids, and they'll try to solve that problem on their own during the semester. And at the end of the semester, we'll have a presentation where they'll all get up and tell us what they did. And then we'll go to lunch and they'll sit with you and you can tell them how you actually solved the problem. That was the big idea. One of the first teams that made this presentation taught me something completely different. So this group of kids stood up and they said, this is how we approach this problem. And the sponsor, I think, was from, at that point, McDonnell Douglas Corporation. He stood up and he said, wow, I'm really impressed. You kids have stumbled onto our patent in this problem. This is actually how we beat Boeing in the competition. It's worth a $200 million contract for McDonnell Douglas. Now, now these are undergraduates, right? So they're like 22. Immediately after the presentation, these kids came up to me and they said, Dr. Miller, we have some questions for you. What's a patent? The second question is, how do you make money from ideas like this? Because none of the
Oh,
engineering courses have dollar signs in them. They all
yeah.
have, integral signs for calculus and stuff, but nothing about dollars. And I said, oops, we have to do something about this. So I went to the business dean. I asked him, do you have any courses, in intellectual property and patent law for engineers, new venture creation and entrepreneurship? He said, oh yeah, we have a lot of classes like that, but you can't get there from here because those are courses for the MBA program. And you're talking about engineers, they've never even had Econ 101. I mean, and then my dean caught me in the hallway and he said, Rick, what are you trying to do? So I explained it to him. And he said, well, don't you realize that if you figure out how to do this, what's going to happen is engineering students are going to start taking business courses. I said, duh, that's the point. Then he said, no, think about it. If they take the business courses, then the tuition dollars are going to go to the business dean and our budget's going to go down.
Mm.
This is called revenue center management.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Right.
That was about the time that I left Southern Cal and I went to the University of Iowa. And Iowa, which is a Big Ten school,
Right.
had not really discovered revenue center management yet. So I worked with the business dean. We developed the first technical minor in engineering. It's called the Technology Entrepreneurship Program.
Mm.
And you could get this from taking a couple of courses in the MBA program, even though you're an undergraduate. It wound up being on the cover of Inc. magazine, like in 93 or something.
Yeah.
And that's what led me to Olin, because the Olin Foundation was quite concerned about the need for change in engineering education today. So why? Well, it turns out if you look at the US economy, one of the strongest and most important exports that the US provides is technology entrepreneurship. Maybe you've heard of Google and Facebook and Tesla and Amazon and so forth. Those companies don't survive without a really strong engineering workforce. Okay, well, the problem is the US basically doesn't produce them. We as a country produce a smaller fraction of our graduating class that goes into engineering than any other developed country that you can think of. In fact, in the US, it's a little over 5% of the bachelor's degrees in America go to kids who study any kind of engineering at any university. In Europe, it's about 12%. In Asia, it's about 30%. We get by because we import a lot of engineering talent. And the second problem is when we do educate them in this country, it's more about research than it is about product development. And so the graduates are always a source of complaints from people in industry. These kids are good at solving equations that have an answer in the back of the book. But actually, a very small fraction of the time that engineers spend is about solving equations. Most of it is about conceiving, finding the problem that the client cares about, finding a way to develop a solution to that problem, doing it on time and on budget that meets client expectations, that actually works in the real world when you test it, it deals with supply chain, all of that stuff. And it's not being taught. So can you fix that? Turns out the US National Science Foundation had been concerned about this in the 90s. They created something called the Engineering Education Coalitions Program, which spent, I think, somewhere around $100 million in 5 years trying to motivate teams of major universities to consider these changes, help to work on the students so that they are better at working together in a team, that they're better at conceiving and designing things, not just solving equations, that they're better at testing them and making sure they work in the workplace, and know something about the cost of what they're doing. Okay, that's what they wanted to have happen. Well, the National Science Foundation did this for about 5 years and then gave up. They did an assessment, and the assessment showed that it wasn't working, that they were spending this money, and there's like a really small handful of faculty members at universities that care about this. The rest of them are sort of folding their arms and saying, good luck with that. I'm going to continue to try to win the Nobel Prize somewhere. And it didn't fly. So the Olin Foundation stepped up to the plate and said, I think we should do something about this. Now, the Olin Foundation itself has histories from Mr. Franklin Olin, who founded the Olin Corporation in the 1800s. And he had retired in 1938, I believe, started this foundation with his wife. And he wanted to give back so that there's next generation has an opportunity. And for 50 years, the Olin Foundation had given money for buildings. They decided to end that program in 1997 and to devote all the rest of their money to starting over in higher education to try to address this problem. Because their philosophy was this: if society has a really difficult problem that's been resistant to change for a generation, it's probably because of basic assumptions that are wrong. It's probably been misdiagnosed from the beginning. And there are elements to this that you haven't thought about or invested in to make a difference. So let's start over and let's eliminate all of the sort of sacred cows in higher education that are likely to be the roadblocks to the breakthrough thinking we need. So, for example, thou shalt not offer tenure. We'll not have academic departments. We will make sure that everything has an expiration date so that a curriculum that gets started doesn't become so traditional that nobody ever challenges it, and so on. So that was their idea.
Yeah.
And I was dean of engineering at Iowa in the 90s, and I got this letter from the Olin Foundation that said, hey, somebody has suggested that you might be the right person to talk to about helping to start this new school. I almost put the letter in the circular file because,
Did you?
who's ever heard of these people? What do they know about this? But I noticed that the person who nominated me was a friend that I had known. He was the president of Harvey Mudd College.
Hmm.
And I thought, I don't want John to never nominate me for anything else. So maybe I should call him up, and I'll talk to them, and then I can explain to John that, it's not a good fit for these reasons, but maybe next time keep me in mind. Of course, you can see how well that turned out. So I called them, I talked to them a while, and near the end of it, Mr. Milas, whose vision it was at the foundation to start this place, explained to me that they plan to fund this in a way with about $500 million in the end to make it free so that kids will go to school without paying tuition, room and board, and it's very merit-based. So they're going to find sort of the best and brightest talent in the country, and they're going to educate them in a new way. And this is going to influence MIT and all the other engineering schools to think differently about what they do. I said, well, it's a little bit crazy, but why would MIT change? They're always number one in the world. But it's pretty interesting. And this is probably the only college presidency that you'll find where the primary job is not raising money.
Yeah.
The primary job is actually getting the right answer to this education thing. So I had to explain to my wife that we're going to relocate. Two kids then in school, which is always difficult. And of course, when I arrived in 1999, was the first employee. Now, the school in 1999 wasn't a school. It was an idea when I came.
Yeah. Yeah.
We didn't have any land. We didn't have any faculty, no curriculum, nothing. And just the four directors of the Olin Foundation and me. So the college was 5 people. By the way, this is unlike any other college leadership board you've ever found. All of the money from the school comes from these 4 people, 100%. There's no tuition, there's no federal money. And by the way, none of them is an engineer, and none of them has ever worked in higher ed. What could possibly go wrong with that?
It actually sounds like a recipe for success, in many ways.
I wound up essentially threatening to resign 3 times in the first 2 years because they were just kind of a little out off the ranch here.
Yeah.
in terms of things they wanted to see done. And I
Mhm.
had a dear mentor that I still have today, in Mary Sue Coleman. Mary Sue was the president of the University of Iowa when I made this
Yeah.
change. She wrote me this 5-page single-spaced letter, as I remember it when I was at Iowa, saying, essentially, Rick, what are you doing? This is crazy. You should not resign from the University of Iowa. You should stay here. You know, I think there's a good chance that you will become a provost somewhere in the Big Ten if you hang in onto this. And maybe someday you might even become the president of a Big Ten university. And I thought about it and I decided, I don't actually want to be the president of a Big Ten university. It's too difficult. I mean, there's too many constraints.
Yeah.
So I'm not intimidated by that. She said, well, you do need to worry about who these people are, because if they have very bizarre views, you're going to wind up being trapped by that in your position. Turns out they do have strong views, but they were good views. They were views that were helpful to break through
Mm.
the thinking. And that's a long answer to your question about starting on the farm, but I think I covered a lot of ground there that might have come up later.
Well, and you drew a wonderful through line um, in terms of connecting the dots in your upbringing, your instincts, your obvious curiosity, um, and willingness, ability to think outside of the box and not be constrained by what is. Um, so thank you for that. It's very enlightening and interesting. I am curious. At the end of the day, what because this was a big risk. It was a big risk for you and for your family. Um, what was it? I mean, are you able to look back and identify what was the thing that that really compelled you to say, yeah, this is what I need to do? Um,
Well, number one, nobody's ever accused me of being reasonable, so that's part of the genetic defect, I guess. But I think when I was the dean at Iowa and I had to make this decision, looking back on it at the time, I had always cared more about teaching and education than my peers, who were other engineering deans, did. When I was at Iowa, we raised money for a new building in short order, like 18 months. We had doubled the research funding and revised the curriculum, all that. But I was concerned mostly about the mission of the university, thinking back to how education changed my life. And the University of Iowa is a public institution, and its job is access. So kids who grow up on farms have a chance to think about the world in a different way because of this institution. So, and the experience with kids at Southern Cal who said, what's a patent and how do you make money from ideas like this? And we saw technology entrepreneurship change things dramatically for Iowa graduates when they left. So I was interested, more interested than I'm supposed to be. Okay. And I found it almost kind of a moral compulsion
oh,
that somebody needs to do this. And I'm at a stage in my life where I could probably pull it off. If it doesn't work, I can find a job. We'll see.
mhm.
It was a risk. It wasn't, I can't, so I wouldn't advise my own PhD students to do that. Um, Not unless you just feel you can't not do that.
Yeah.
I found like-minded people because it was such a bizarre thing. And what made the school work, of course, is the people. This is the thing people overlook. If you're going to start with a blank sheet, and believe me, we've seen a lot of that at Olin.
Mhm.
So in the last 10 years before leaving Olin, we had hosted visits from leaders of about 800 universities in 65 countries.
Mm.
Many of them are trying to replicate the Olin thing somewhere else. And you can tell talking from them that the ingredients are not right. They're thinking about it in the wrong way. So I keep trying to explain it. It takes like at least three things to be successful. You need people, you need ideas, and you need resources. But the ordering of those is really important. You need people first. If you have the right people, they will come up with the right ideas. And with
Mm.
the people and the ideas, most of the time you can generate the resources you need if what you're doing is important. If you have great resources, a terrific building and a big endowment and the wrong people, good luck with that. I think it's not going to turn out well. And I've seen this movie play out mostly in other countries, but I've seen it even in the US as well. So this trajectory at Olin has been a real surprise. In the last, just before stepping down, a number of things really sort of caught my attention. One of them was these letters I got from parents constantly. What
Yeah.
did you do to my kid? Okay. I mean, this is an engineering school, right? So the kids, when they came in the door, were really bright, but they're quite mathematical. They're really good at math, but
Mm.
not so socially incorporated with their peers. Some of them had never had a date, that kind of thing. And their parents told me, well, we were hopeful that, they didn't know what they were getting into when they came to Olin. We were hopeful they'd get a job and wouldn't live in our basement, when they got done. But now, amazing. Now they're literally on the TED stage. Something has transformed these kids.
Yeah.
So one of them already, and this is a young lady named Frances Haugen. Frances was the Facebook whistleblower.
Yeah.
She's in Olin class of '06.
Mm.
I knew Frances when she was in the 7th grade.
Mm.
She shared a music stand with our younger daughter in junior high school or middle
Mhm.
school. I think it's amazing, and the number of them that we kept hearing this about, and we began to conclude this is not an accident. There's something happening here, and MIT in a study in 2018, it's called the Global Benchmark Study
Mhm.
of engineering education. They hired a consultant from the UK, and the study came back showing that Olin is among the top 2 engineering programs in the world. And this is in 2018. We hadn't graduated anybody until 2006. So it's like only 12 graduating classes. It's already there. So there's something unusual happening. And a foundation president came to me and said, Rick, you need to do something about this. This is revitalizing education. I'm calling it transformative.
Mm.
It changes who they are. It doesn't just change what they know, it changes who they are. And it changes who they are in a way which is positive, which is optimistic, it's empowering. It gives them a can-do spirit, and they are willing to devote their lives to something purposeful and meaningful. The world needs this. And this was the president of the Kern Family Foundation.
Mm.
And I said, oh, yeah, I see what you're saying, but, no one's going to listen to me, Jim. Number one, I'm an engineer, right? My aunt and uncle still think what I do is fix cars and TVs, so I'm not allowed to have ideas about things like education. No one will listen to me. He said, just try it. He said, we're working with the medical schools, and there is a very strong program for revitalizing medical education that the Kern family has started. So I talked to them about it, and I said, Jim isn't going to go away, so I need to do something about this. So we had a meeting in 2017 of about 12 presidents and provosts of universities at Chicago O'Hare to look at the data that the Gallup folks had just produced with Purdue University called the Gallup Purdue Index, which is really just taking their 80-year-old program and studying well-being and happiness across the globe and narrowing it to study the influences that college might have on well-being. So we brought Brandon Bustede, who's now at
Yeah.
Kaplan, but Brandon was the
Mhm.
guy who was the architect of that study. And then because, we're not social scientists, we brought Carol Dweck in from
Yep.
Stanford, who's brilliant, and to help us make sense of it. A lot of head nodding went on. When we found out the Gallup study shows 2 things jump off the page when you want to know what really matters in higher education, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years later. Number one, someone cared about me as a person while I was an undergraduate. I wasn't just a number. They knew my name. I could ask them for a reference letter. They know me now, even though I graduated years later. Someone cared about me as a person. The other thing they found was that education is not just about books and tests at this place. They want you to use it today. You can, in fact, I have a project that I did in my sophomore year, and I went off campus and I did this with these people applying what I learned in the classroom. If the students told you those two things, someone cared about me, inspired me, followed me later, and the things that I studied, I had an opportunity to use right away, doubled their life well-being for an entire life, 10, 20, 30 years later. Now, we weren't totally surprised by the results, but everybody in the room said, sure, yeah, that's great. You know, we've been doing that for a long time. That's what we do at University XYZ. And then Brandon showed us the penultimate number in the survey. What fraction of the students report that they get that data? I mean, they get that experience. And it turns out about 3%. Oops. So we concluded at the end of that meeting, something's got to change. That we really need to focus more on the core mission of higher education, which I don't believe is winning the Nobel Prize or winning the national championship in football.
Yeah.
I think the core mission is to prepare the next generation. Prepare the next generation for upward mobility and a lifetime of well-being. The data shows you can do that.
Yeah.
Even though we're not paying a lot of attention to it right now. We've got our priorities backwards. And a dear friend from Oklahoma, John Brock, who has created the Brock International Prize in Education in honor of his wife, he says it this way: the most important thing we do in this life is educate our children.
Yeah.
How can you argue with that?
And I wanted to ask you about the Coalition for Life Transformative Education, because you made a decision to step down a little early before your contract was going to end at Olin, to focus on founding. And you were a founder. You did found. You were one of the co-founders of this coalition, which very much grew out of the work that you just described in terms of the Gallup poll. So can you tell us a little bit more? How did you know? I'm curious how you knew it was time to step away from Olin and do something different. And how does the approach that the coalition is taking address the gaps or these problems that you've been talking about? And there are a number of different emphases here through the coalition. One is the human relations and mindset emphasis, another intrinsic motivation. You've talked about that and written about that. Another is evidence-based interventions. So I'd just like to hear a little bit more about the work of the coalition, what you're hoping to do, and those particular emphases.
Yeah, there's two things there. What are the changes that's needed? And secondly, how do you change higher ed anyway? Which is, not a science. It's a aspiration mostly. So what are the changes that are needed? And I think the Gallup data shows someone cared about me as a person. This is reinforced by work that Howard Gardner did recently, the Real World of College, which showed from 2,000 interviews on 10 campuses over 7 years that the number one problem that young people are facing has to do with belonging and identity development, mental health. So we're calling someone cared about me as a person a placeholder for identity and belonging, number one. Number two, the ability to connect what you're doing in the classroom to the real world. We're calling a placeholder for agency, a can-do attitude, a self-sufficiency, which is related to intrinsically motivated learning. The last part, which is beyond the Gallup-Purdue Index, but came out of a study at Bates, is called purposeful work, in which students find that even in a liberal arts education, you're going to look for a career when you're done. And if you find and deliberately focus your effort on finding something that brings meaning and purpose to your life, This increases your well-being for decades by a factor of 10, according to the Gallup study. Identity, agency, and purpose. Now, the question is, can you do that? I mean, the data says that these are correlate really well with well-being. Can you do, what would it look like? So I'll walk you through a little case study of our experiments at Olin that illustrated this. It actually can happen. We have this course at Olin, which is about design thinking that every kid has to take. And it's to get them to think differently, to think in the real world about their role and about the tools that they're learning in engineering. So on the first day of class, we put them in small groups of about 5, and we ask them this question. We want you to identify a group of people whose lives you want to change. Not someday, but like in the next 4 months. And then we just listen. It's really important you ask them who they care about, because this brings in intrinsically motivated learning, rather than telling them you're going to work with these people and do X. So we listened. In this one case study, a young lady said, well, my grandmother has Alzheimer's now. We had to visit her in assisted living during the holidays. Her life's all different. I'd like to do something for the elderly. So we said, that's a great project. So we found 10 elderly people who live within like a 10-minute drive of campus who were willing to be interviewed by these kids for about 2 hours. And in the first 2 weeks, they did 20 hours of interviews in a nursing home with elderly people about their lives. So they brought sticky notes and they were taking quotes. And so the point of this is, what does it mean to be elderly in America today? And what is it that keeps them up at night? What are they most worried about? So they come home and they have all these notes, and they organize them on a wall according to sort of themes. This has to do with health, that has to do with money, that has to do with family, so on. What did they hear? Because remember, there's a purpose here. You need to come up with an intervention of some kind that would change their lives for the better. So they were thinking about ideas. What they heard was something to the effect, you know, a neighbor 2 doors down fell and broke her hip last week. And this has happened over and again. And while they do surgery and usually it's fixed, it doesn't always come out well. And sometimes they're confined to a wheelchair permanently. And their life just completely changes. And she said, so tell me about it. He said, well, the number one thing is that when you're in a wheelchair, you can't look people in the eye when they come to see you. You can look at their belt buckle, but they're always looking down on you. And when your family comes on the weekend and they congregate behind you, they talk about you in the third person. It's like you're a problem now to be solved. You kind of lose humanity. And then there are other consequences too. If you're confined to the wheelchair, you can't walk now. So you can't burn calories at the same rate. Your whole metabolism changes. It's very difficult to keep track of your weight. Even finding out how much you weigh is a big ordeal because they have to hold you up by your elbows on the scale. So just don't want to deal with it. So the kids said, next 2 weeks, I have to brainstorm. What are we going to do about this? Something to the effect, well, look, we're 19 years old. I don't think we're going to solve the aging thing today. Maybe we can do something about their weight. They said how awkward that was. What if we just imagine this little carpet that you could drive your wheelchair on, and the carpet has these pressure sensors underneath it, and it transfers this data with an RFID radio transmitter to your iPhone. Your iPhone has some software on it. It subtracts off the empty weight of the wheelchair, and it tells you, Melissa, this is what you weigh today, 100 pounds, okay? What do you think of that? I think we could do that? So this is on their list. Now they go back to the people at the nursing home, and they explain to them they've been thinking about this, and 2 things happen. Number one, the people in the nursing home say, you're back. Number one, you know how rare it is for people to come and visit us, particularly people who are your age? Number two, you really listened to us. You heard what we had to say. And you know this scale thing that you're going to make with a carpet? Do you think you could actually build one of those things? Because that would be really cool. And the kid said, well, we don't know if we can build it. We don't have a course in how to do this, but we're going to find out. This is what I call intrinsically motivated learning. Now they come back to campus and they are on fire to find out what is a pressure sensor. Does anybody build these things around here? I want to go have lunch with the professor that does that. I don't care about the course. I don't have time for the course. I have to know it now. At the end of the term, they built one. They had this whole thing working. They bring it back to the nursing home and they show it to the people in the nursing home and they say, look what we did. Another emotional event. There are tears in the eyes of the people in the nursing home now that says, if you can make this, like this can change my life. The kids learned 3 things. By the way, to finish the story, this particular team went on with the project. They decided to enter the business plan competition at Babson College next door, which is a business school that specializes in entrepreneurship. They realized that they had already product they had built that has a clientele for it, that there's no one else in the market. All they needed to know was the price point. How do you manufacture and sell this thing? They won the business plan prize, like $10,000 at Babson, and they started making them in their dormitory before Christmas. They're called lily pad scales. You can find them today. They are bought by a company now and they're commercialized. When you look back on this long case study, 3 things jump off the page. Yes, they ran into the physics and the engineering aspects when they built the prototype. They didn't learn it by a course. They learned it by intrinsically motivated learning. They were driven because they had a goal and a deadline and people they cared about. Number 1, you can't sit in 20 hours of interviews in a nursing home with people mostly in their 80s without it changing your identity and your sense of belonging. Number 2, because they didn't have a course and they had to figure it out and they actually made something work, they developed a strong sense of agency, a can-do spirit. And the last thing is, when they brought the product back and the people could see that it was there and would change their lives, and they saw the tears in their eyes, they said, this brings meaning to my work. Now I know why I want to be an engineer, okay? I want to change the world for the better. So they got what? Identity, agency, and purpose. And they got this out of an engineering design course. And my claim is if you can do that in engineering design, you can do that in any other course in the university because it's the least likely thing to have you opportunity to build things like that. So that's what you need to do. Now, the next question is, can you do this at scale? Can you do this in a liberal arts college? So we need to innovate. So we began to try to incentivize this by challenging faculty at institutions to create evidence-based interventions. And the evidence-based that we're starting with is the Gallup data, identity, agency, and purpose, that must touch all enrolled students. This is one of the traps that's happened in higher ed. We focus on what is the narrow problem. Let's just fix that. So we're talking about interventions that touch every enrolled student. That's inclusive. That includes the under-resourced, it includes the talented and gifted, but it includes all of them. What we're really talking about is general education, right? Number 3, it must be assessed. You must commit to making assessment of what you're doing to guide you to understand how to improve it along the way. This is the engineer in me, right? I know it. Nothing you build as an engineer works the first time. You might we don't even expect that. It's not failure. It's part of the process of getting it right. And we're mostly interested in, and this is the sort of fundamental difference between what we do and what a lot of other places have done. We're not just focused on improving the graduation rate or the retention rate or the starting salary of the kids who leave our place. It's focusing on what happens to them decades after they graduate. It's about changing the well-being of our society because higher education needs to be the source of upward mobility and an improvement in life in the country. That's why the public should invest in it. It's a public good if you do that. It's not a private benefit.
Now that's the long game, and that's a wonderful, much needed long game. What are the nearer term effects or impacts that you anticipate or that you're aiming for in students' lives?
Sure. Well, we have a group of almost 20 universities right now doing this with faculty-driven interventions, and they're all doing different things, and they're happening right now. So we have three themes. There's a group working on identity and belonging. This we found that the power tool for making it happen is storytelling. And we have a psychologist, Jonathan Adler, who is, I think, editor of a Journal of Personality or something, who has been working about storytelling as a tool for shaping identity. This has been picked up at, for example, the University of Michigan, Dearborn, which is a predominantly underrepresented minority institution. They have taken this with the idea that if you are coached and filmed telling your own story in front of your peers, that's a pretty high bar. If you learn to do this well, it literally changes how you think about yourself and your own identity. And this can have transformative impact on your life. We have another group that's working on agency. One of this team is at the University of Maine. So there was an article recently in the Chronicle on their work. They're across all 7 campuses in the University of Maine system. They're getting students involved in making things and building things with research projects. It's called RLE, Research Learning Experience for undergraduates. And they're monitoring the data to see how it affects their sense of agency, can-do spirit as they go through school. And then we have a group that's doing purpose, and this is probably the biggest one. Bates College, I mentioned earlier, a factor of 10 improvement in their sense of well-being as a result of finding purposeful work and meaning in their career. Of all the places, those key ideas were picked up at Arizona State University, which is about as opposite from Bates College as you can imagine. They have now developed something called the Work Plus program, realizing the majority of their students are involved in work while they're also a student, and have decided, well, rather than ignore that and claim that has nothing to do with academics, what if we embrace that as an opportunity to build purpose and meaning into their educational model? That's growing. Bucknell University has a program called Bucknell on Purpose, which opens big conversations with undergraduates about purpose in their life. And you find that there's this enormous hole. Kids now more than ever feel overwhelmed by the grand challenges of our time, by by issues and wars, by climate change, and they're worried. They want to talk about it. They need faculty in the room, not to grade them or judge them, but to help them explore their own feelings. Bucknell on Purpose. These are the kinds of things that could create a sea change for improving the purpose of well-being and the public's perception that we're worthy of their trust. And we are not working against what they think is right for their kids. We're partners with them in how we create this new world. So that's, by the way, and I'm derelict for not bringing this up earlier, to try to get this out, to try to change the conversation, we've invested in a new digital magazine. It's called Learning Well.
I saw that on your website. Yes.
Learning Well, we think, will be able to put on stage the best practices that you see in practice at scale that are evidence-based, that address identity, agency, and purpose in every kind of institution in the country. And so instead of arguing about whether this is needed or not, or arguing about whether it can be done or what it would cost, and if only somebody would give us $1 gazillion, what if we just find people who are doing it and get them together and let you see for yourself how they made it happen? And Learning Well's primary mission is to get the message out so that, and not in a judgmental way, not in a we're smarter than you are way, but here's how it works at scale.
And we're at the end of our time here. So 2 things before I ask you our final signature question. I just wanted to comment on the Arizona State example. One of the things I really appreciate about that is that it is taking an integrative kind of approach. And as well as anybody that, there's been such a pendulum shift toward this focus on work, career, job readiness to the exclusion of all of these other things that are elements of your paradigm at the coalition. And so it's very encouraging to know that there are schools that are moving the pendulum back and looking at how can we integrate and do both, because it's not a matter of either or. What are you thinking is going to be the most effective way to spread the word and get more institutions engaged in this work?
Well, as our friends in design thinking will point out, the first step in solving any problem is to accepting the problem as yours. You can't you can't solve a problem you aren't willing to have. And for the last 5 years, it's felt to me that I'm watching this train wreck in slow motion in the country where the public is disengaging, and America is like unique in the world for the public not appreciating investments in higher ed. It's also unique in the world for charging so much money directly to families for education. There are lots of things we're doing wrong. The big problem is getting their attention. It's feel like this voice in the wilderness. This is not going to end well, folks. How do we get your attention? I think that's changing. I think that's changing rapidly now. There is this sort of opportunity to open this discussion on campuses today that didn't exist even a year ago. So now the question, once it's open, how do you change it? And again, I think the gold standards for real lasting change in university include changes in promotion and tenure, and they include changes in the general education program. Most universities don't change their general education formula but once every couple of generations. I mean, it's like once or twice every 100 years. It's too bad because the world is changing so fast that we need to think much more quickly about these issues. How do you change promotion and tenure? How do you change general ed? Number one, you never change general education without a faculty vote. As long as you have academic freedom and tenure, the tenured faculty vote is going to be the bottom line. Good luck if you want to try to do it over their objections. You have to win over the hearts and the minds of the core faculty in the institution. They have to trust you, and they have to believe it's in the best interest of their children, in the best interest of the career that they've chosen. That's a long game. You don't do that tomorrow. But the best way to do that is to ask them for help. Don't come in and wag your finger and say, we have the answers. Tell them what the problem is, invite them to solve it, work to find resources to get them the opportunity to do that. We had an opportunity to present to 116 community college presidents in California, the Community College League of California, just at the end of last year. They're anxious for this kind of an opportunity to change. So it takes faculty, but this is bottom line, this is a culture shift. And this might be jumping to your penultimate question, but to me, the core of this is about mission. In fact, when I talk about this coalition now, I normally start with a slide, the very first slide, which asks the simple question, what is the mission of higher education? And I have 3 candidates on the list. The first one is the actual, or paraphrased, actual mission statement that was active at the University of Iowa when I was there 30 years ago. And remember, Iowa's got 30,000 students. It's got, dozens of departments and very diverse from medicine to law to business to engineering, liberal arts, education. What was their mission? This is to create knowledge, to disseminate knowledge, and to preserve knowledge for the benefit of the state, the nation, and the world. That was a pretty common mission statement in those days. But I have one question. Where do students show up in the mission? I mean, you could do that actually at a research lab somewhere, a government lab. It's sort of missing the 25,000 of the people who are running around on campus. There's another mission statement candidate, which would come right out of Howard Gardner's book from last year. Ask the kids who are there what they think the mission of the university is, and they'll tell you, over half of them will tell you, it's primarily to prepare me for my first career. It's about the students getting prepared for their life. What we're proposing as a sea change is that we need to become known in this country. Higher education needs to become known as primarily focused on the next generation, preparing them for a life of upward mobility and lifetime flourishing and well-being. And the evidence shows that's possible.
Well, and that is indeed the answer to my last question, which is the signature question, the piece of advice that you believe is critical for transforming the future of higher education. So, Rick, I am so grateful for this time and for the conversation and for the work that you're doing at the coalition, which is I think, the most significant work you will have done in your lifetime. So thank you for that, and for your time today. I have learned so much, and I'm inspired. So,
Well, thank you. Thank you for your interest, and thank you for the work that you're doing. Leadership in higher education is critical. You can't change things as a faculty member if the leadership isn't on board. So we need enlightened and committed leadership to making these changes happen, and that's what you're doing, which I'm greatly appreciating.
yeah. Well, thank you. We're all on a journey, and I think we are connected by a common mission in many ways. So, so all the best to you going forward.
Thank you, and you too.